Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. Pope John Paul II was an artist, an author, an actor, a philosopher, and a theologian. But most important, he was a lover of freedom and liberty. In this episode, Reason Magazine's managing editor, Stephanie Slade, sits down with Eric Kohn to discuss her new article on the Pope who helped bring down communism. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/podcast. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Stephanie Slade is managing editor of Reason. Prior to joining Reason, she worked as a speechwriter, a pollster, and a regular contributor to U.S. News and World Report. In 2013, she was named a finalist for the Bastiat Prize for Journalism. In 2016, she was selected as a Robert Novak Journalism Fellow. She's a proud graduate of the University of Florida, where she earned a BA in Economics and Political Science. The article she has in the most recent issue of Reason Magazine is The Pope Who Helped Bring Down Communism. Stephanie, welcome to Acton Line.
Thanks so much for having me back on.
So my typical question for people who have books out and come on the podcast is, what's your book about? And I guess the same thing can apply to magazine articles. The title, well communicates it, but what is your article about?
Well, let me start by saying that this article is actually part of a special issue, the December issue of Reason Magazine. We did a theme issue commemorating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union, which is December of this year. And we thought that 30 years was a good point to stop and look back at what had happened and what have we learned from it. So as part of that package, I contributed this article about the legacy of Pope St. John Paul II. Because what I found was that I'm Catholic, and most of the Catholics I know of my generation or older are pretty well aware of the role that Pope John Paul II played in helping to bring about the end of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But when I talked to some of my libertarian friends and my more secular friends and colleagues, Reason is a secular magazine, so some of them had no idea what I was talking about when I mentioned this, and I thought that is a tragedy. I mean, libertarians who believe in individual liberty, libertarians were anti-communist. People should be aware of this incredible story about the sort of legacy and the very important role that Pope John Paul II played. So that's what this article is trying to remedy.
So describe the role that Pope John Paul II played.
Yeah, he was elected in 1979 as Pope. He's Polish, so he had been living up until that point under communism. You know, he had been a priest and then a bishop in Poland during the communist era. And he knew how sort of evil this regime was. And he had already been exercising during his time as bishop a sort of subtle cultural resistance to the regime, in part because the communist regime that was in place at that time was explicitly atheist. It was trying to push. The Soviet Union was trying to push what it called this Marxist scientific atheism, and it really was not. It was very hostile to religion and to people of faith.
Well, probably beyond even being atheist, anti-theist, and certainly, as you acknowledge in the article, the acknowledgement from Gorbachev later on that they engaged in a war on religion.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite bad. Now, it was less bad in Poland, in part because the Polish people were it was such a deeply Catholic country that the attempts that were more successful in Russia and some other parts of the Soviet world to stamp out religion, to drive the Catholic Church and people of faith out of the picture, it was less successful in Poland. But Pope John Paul II, or at the time, Bishop Wojtyla, his role in sort of keeping the people connected to their faith during the course of this sort of occupation and repression was part of why it was less successful in Poland. And so the Polish people never quite were willing to part with their religious attachments during the whole course of the Soviet era. And when Pope John Paul II was elected Pope, actually, when he was elevated to the papacy in 1979, this led to just an explosion of pride in the people of Poland. This was the first Slavic pope. It was our pope. And I think that it's well understood now that that moment when he was elected and when he, a little less than a year later, returned to Poland as pope for his first state visit there, and the pope set foot on Polish soil, and the crowds came out to see him and to cheer for him, that was the beginning of the rise of the solidarity opposition to communism that eventually brought down the Soviet Union. I mean, it was the beginning of the end.
So that's interesting. I think we get so much of the credit, especially in the United States, right, is given to Ronald Reagan for the role that he as head of state really at the leading up to just before the fall of the Soviet Union for doing all of that. But there's been several books and one I know that you cite in the article as well that look at the roles together of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Ronald Reagan, and Pope John Paul II as leading figures in all of that. What do we know about their whatever cross relationships that there were, and how that dynamic between the three of them worked and why that was so important for this particular cause? It
was important, but I would like to emphasize that the Pope was elected again in 1979. This was a year before Reagan was elected president. Mm-hmm. And Reagan, there's this great story of him sitting in his study watching on TV as the Pope landed in Poland for his first state visit as Pope, and the crowds that came out, and the just incredible outpouring of enthusiasm. And he said, I have a feeling that religion is going to be the Soviets' Achilles heel. He saw from across the world, before he was even elected president, that this was going to be the thing that was going to be the undoing of the Soviet Union. So once then he was elected president, before long, I mean, he and Pope John Paul II and Margaret Thatcher as well developed a really close working relationship because I think they all sensed that there was an opportunity here. After decades under Soviet rule, this was a crack showing in this sort of, so he saw this as an opportunity. So this was not the only strategy that Reagan pursued. He also, of course, was a big believer in sort of the competing on the plane of military buildup and technology and that sort of thing. But he saw that, this attempt to impose atheism on the people of Poland, it was not flying. And in fact, it was causing a backlash. It was causing restlessness among the Polish people. Mm-hmm. It was causing them to sort of decide that that they had enough and that they were going to start organizing to try to resist the communist regime. And from there, the neighboring countries in the Eastern Bloc were inspired, and there was more foment there. There was more opposition and resistance happening there, and eventually this would sort of snowball in 1991 December, the lowering of the Soviet flag from above the Kremlin for the last time. So that was 30 years ago this year. It really it began with the outpouring of enthusiasm for John Paul setting foot back in Poland after being elected Pope about 12 years earlier, and ended with the end of the Soviet Union.
I'm curious what you think of just a kind of character of a certain people that was, we find these kinds of stories throughout history if it seems that you find the right people in the right places at the right times. I have a friend who we talk every once in a while, and he's particularly kind of pessimistic on the modern scene. And I share some of his concerns about what we look out going on. And he continually says to me that his what he sees as the only, maybe not the only, but really the most expeditious way of getting this country out of some of the problems that it's in is we need a Lincoln figure. We need somebody like that now. Just the way that you needed somebody like Lincoln at the time that Lincoln came along. And I guess my point to him is always that, we have, at least in this country, and I think here's another example of it too, the circumstances bringing the right people to the fore. I mean, there was nothing foreordained about those three individuals, and particularly about John Paul II being the one who would be in that position at that time with a particular connection to a particular people under Soviet oppression that would be able to snowball a movement like this. You could call it divine providence. It could have worked out differently. And I think in the way that we think about circumstances right now, like we think that there's just this, it's a Marxist idea that there is a capital H history that we're all marching towards. But we also could see that there's somebody in the right place at the right time. There seems to be, at least to me, something miraculous about that.
Yeah, and I would never want to discount the incredible importance of personal agency. And if any of these figures had not acted on the opportunity that they had to make a difference, we wouldn't have ended up where we did. At the same time, Reagan believed in what he called the DP, the divine plan. He believed that he and Pope John Paul II were a part of something bigger than themselves. It's an interesting, I don't really emphasize this much in the article, but they were both shot in within a matter of a few weeks or maybe a couple of months of each other, but attempted assassinations of both Reagan and the Pope. And the Pope's assassin, we know, was in fact in the employ of the Bulgarian communist government. It was the communist government who saw the Pope as such a threat that they hired an assassin to try to take him out. He was shot twice. He very nearly died, but he survived. And just a few weeks earlier, something similar had happened to Reagan, although his was just a sort of crazy person who had shot him. But the two of them they both independently believed that they had been saved for a reason, and that the purpose that they were in these positions of power for, and the purpose for which they had been saved was to help to bring about the end of communism. So they really did believe in this providence in a very profound way. And that was, I think, part of why they felt such a bond to each other and were willing to work so closely together to try to move along this project. And I didn't get into the details. Your last question was about what did Reagan and what did they actually do? Well, they provided a covert material support for the opposition movement in Poland, which was known as Solidarity. So Solidarity emerged in response to the Pope's first visit back to Poland. It was a trade union. It was resistant to the communist system. It was asking for liberalization, democratization. The workers wanted rights that they didn't have under communism. And so they started organizing and they started protesting and they started, sending underground newsletters around. And this movement within a matter of less than a year exploded to 10 million people were a member of the Solidarity trade union. And when the Soviets cracked down on it, Reagan and the Pope and Thatcher and a lot of civil society organizations too, including the AFL-CIO, the American sort of labor movement, interestingly, was a part of this as well, provided material. They snuck a material support in to keep this labor union, this trade union, and which was the locus of the opposition to communism, going when the Soviets were trying to stamp it out. So this is what they did. That was sort of concrete help provided to keep the opposition going and eventually have them, ensure that they would outlast actually the Soviets, which they did. Yeah, I just realized that I've been saying 79, but I think it was actually 78 when he was elected, 79 when his first visit occurred. Mm-hmm. So sorry for the confusion there. I
think they also, we could say, certainly from the Pope and Reagan and Thatcher as well, they also thought differently about it. I mean, for so long, so many people in those positions of power and authority and responsibility, the thought was about, how do we manage to coexist in this world with this regime? And it was a difference in thinking. I mean, you really prior to, you'd say, 78, 79, leading up to the 1980 election here in the United States. You have already Margaret Thatcher there in the United Kingdom. You have John Paul II becoming Pope in 79. To have people thinking about, they're there to end communism, that they're there to help bring it down. That's just a remarkable change in the way that they thought about it as opposed to the way that their predecessors had thought about what do we do about this problem. Absolutely. Yeah. One of my absolute favorite quotes from Reagan, actually, which is not something he said in one of his great speeches like, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He was in a meeting with one of his aides. Again, I think this was before he was elected president. And this aide asked, what would your strategy, if you're elected, what would your strategy on communism be? What is your goal? And he said, this is my goal. We win, they lose. And this was just like a sort of
I mean, it was like a revolutionary way of approaching the Cold War because, as you say, at that time, virtually everybody thought that the Soviet Union was much stronger, in a much stronger position than we now, in retrospect, know it actually was. We thought that they were going to last forever, that they were probably, they're doing military exercises on the borders, threatening to invade their neighboring countries. There's obviously the threat of nuclear holocaust hanging over everything, of nuclear war that could, annihilate the human race. There was a lot of fear, and there was a misperception that the Soviet Union was that it was invincible, right? And that if anything, we were in the weaker position compared to them. Reagan, in a real way, he saw through that, and I think the Pope did as well. He saw the weaknesses of this sort of rigid top-down system because he had lived in Poland underneath it. He had very up close and personal experience with it, and he saw how poorly it did at meeting the people's needs and material needs and spiritual needs as well, and saw what an opportunity that presented to harness the people on the ground to resist and to eventually bring down this menace.
I'm also struck by having an important religious figure like the Pope. It allows, and I think they brought back into the vocabulary, and it seems to me also that it's something we've excised from our vocabulary in current circumstances, the willingness to identify things for what they are, right? To say that there is good and evil in the world and to identify it as such. And we, prior to that, in the same way that we talked about coexisting, in the same way now that we talk about a lot of different systems as just being different, right? That nothing is better or worse than another. It's just a different way of doing it. You have obviously Reagan calling it an evil empire, but certainly somebody who is, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope of the Catholic Church, can speak about those things in a way that was probably necessary to create the circumstances that led to the end of it.
That's exactly right. And when he would visit Poland, he would give these speeches where he would tap dance right up to the edge of calling on people to do something about this. I mean, he said at one point, there is no justice if there's no independent Poland on the map, which was an almost direct reference to the sort of Soviet, practically the sort of practical occupation, the fact that Moscow was dictating to the communist government in Poland how it should, how the country should be run. He talked about the incredible importance of faith in culture, which was an almost direct rebuke to the sort of imposition of atheism. He recognized the problem, and he was actually a lot more. He demonstrated a lot more courage in terms of speaking openly about it, even when he was on the ground. During these visits, he made I believe it was three visits to Poland during the 10 years between when he was elected and when Poland gained its independence finally. And he just went far beyond what even some of the other Catholic leaders were willing to do because they were trying to keep the peace. I mean, that was it was an understandable impulse. We want to keep the peace. We want to avoid this nuclear war. He was not afraid to sort of call it like he saw it, and just as Reagan was when he made that famous evil empire speech. And by the way, in the same issue of the magazine, we have a great article from Kathy Young, who she was born in Soviet Russia. Her family left, and she says yes, it was an evil empire, and it's a great piece that I would highly recommend everybody check out as well.
I'm curious what you think about modern times. There are some people wanting to make a comparison. We had this Cold War between us and the Soviet Unions, really from the end of the Second World War until 1991 when it collapses. It's not the exact same circumstance between us and China now, but there are people wanting to make that comparison that we're in some kind of a Cold War with China. And I'm also curious what you think of if we're lacking that kind of courage now from people in positions like, Pope John Paul II was in at that time to call things what they really are, right? So we, here at the Acton Institute, we're working on a documentary on Jimmy Lai, who's the pro-democracy activist in Hong Kong, who is a Catholic. And I just can only observe, we don't hear much about what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in China from our current Pope. And I'm wondering if I think this filters down to people within the Catholic Church and people just in general? Is there a loss of courage to call things what they are and to say it in no uncertain terms?
I think there are definitely parallels with China. In fact, increasingly, when China comes up in conversation, I am reminded of that quote I mentioned a moment ago from Reagan: "The we win, they lose. That's my plan." I think that China is probably a lot weaker in terms of its in terms of its sort of economic and geopolitical status than we know. Just like we did not, most people did not realize that the Soviet Union was as weak as it was until the moment that it collapsed. I think if we have faith in our system of free markets and exchange and free society, that we should be more optimistic about the sort of competition that we're currently in with China, about whether they have the enduring power that a lot of people seem to assume that the next century is going to be the Chinese century. Well, I'm not convinced of that. I'm not convinced of that for the same reason that Reagan wasn't convinced that the Soviet Union would last. So I think we should not be afraid to call out human rights, injustices and human rights abuses, and to talk about those things for fear that our ability to coexist with China in the future would be impaired or something. I think we need to be willing to talk about these things. I think there's a real moral imperative there. But I think also we should be optimistic. We should have more faith in our system compared to theirs. If we believe that, again, that prices matter and that, that sort of all of the things that we as Americans tend to believe about the importance of unleashing the creativity of free people, and that produces a more dynamic and enduring system, then there should be really no doubt in our minds that the Chinese system, which is in many ways the complete opposite of that, could possibly outlast us or be superior. I think we have the superior system, and we've lost a little bit of faith in that. So that nowadays a lot of people on both the left and the right seem to think that the correct answer to China is to make our system more like theirs, more top-down control, more subsidies, more crackdown, more trade restrictions.
Tom Friedman in the New York Times wondering what it would be like if we could be China for a day. Yeah. Well, we were talking about this on one of our podcasts recently too. That it's the remarkable story of when you look at the progress that China has made in terms of bringing people out of poverty, improving standards of living there, while still ceding that, there's more economic freedom there, but there's still not an increase in political and personal freedom in that sense. It was only after they killed tens of millions of people in an attempt to achieve communist perfection. And as a last resort, they embrace some semblance of market liberalization. And you have people that will look at it like the Tom Friedmans of the world and say, by God, it must be the totalitarianism. So there's clearly a confusion there. But I think about this every once in a while. Is I enjoy Cold War movies, often spy stories, right? And you find that people who were working as spies for the Soviet Union did so because they believed in that system. And what I think is interesting vis-a-vis China is you don't see that as much of people, spying for China because they believe in the system. They do it because China's paying them. And I think even in that would seem to suggest to me a certain weakness to the system. They don't even inspire the true believers that the Soviet Union did, which ended up collapsing. They're essentially, it's all financially motivated. You see that in the way the NBA reacted, the way that people with financial interest in there. And certainly that's a different problem and a big problem in and of itself, but it's a different problem.
I just think we need to recover our belief in our system in a way that some people I think have lost or have become, they're wavering on, which is not to say that I think that we need to be doing more spying, right? But I think that there's a crisis of confidence right now in whether free society and is a better way of life, and that's tragedy because it is absolutely a better way of life, both in sort of in and of itself. A free society is a better society, and in terms of the sort of the follow-on consequences, the material flourishing and abundance that follow from having a free society.
Well, I think this would be a good opportunity to turn to another area that you've spent a lot of time covering, which is the changes on the political right in the United States, because in probably a couple decades ago, you would normally expect that the people who are the biggest boosters of our system, if you're breaking it down to the left and the right in America, the ones who are always the first and foremost there defending our system and American exceptionalism was on the right, and you're seeing less of that now. So we talked earlier. I know you didn't attend the National Conservative Conference this year, but you went to the one in D.C. a couple of years ago. Because you've been following this so closely and writing about it, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that project and where it's at right now, 2 years after that first conference and a few years after we even started talking about something called national conservatism or a post-liberal right or any of the other terms that are thrown into this big mix.
Yeah, my sense is that the national conservative movement doesn't quite know what it's up to right now. I'll say, I've been arguing for a long time that actually they were misdiagnosing something. So basically what happened is you have this shocking victory of Donald Trump in 2016. People want to know, how did this happen? Nobody saw this coming. Why was there such incredible, overwhelming support for Trump? And the theory out of which the National Conservative Conference and movement emerged was, it was economic dissatisfaction. It was, we don't build things in this country anymore. And, the jobs are drying up in small towns. And we need more protectionism. We need more government subsidies to try to turn this around to help American businesses and industry compete with foreign competition. If that means less immigrants, less trade, so be it. If it means a bigger government that spends more money, so be it. That was the thesis, that was the hypothesis that was put forward to explain how we ended up with Trump. I think that is almost completely wrong. So I think if you look at the polling data, there was a great poll done by the EPPC, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, in January of this year. They surveyed people who had voted for Trump in 2020 and looked at what they cared about and what they were motivated by. And what they found was it was primarily not economics at all. It was cultural issues. It was a sense of being under assault in our culture. So people of faith, especially Christians, people who are more right of center politically, white people, that our culture tells all these people that they are evil and bigoted, that there are attempts on the left to pass laws that would force Christian bakers to make cakes for gay weddings against their will, that would make Catholic nuns pay for birth control against their will. They feel like the mainstream media is in the bag for the Democratic Party. So there was really cultural dissatisfaction and not economic dissatisfaction. And so I think that the national conservative movement really misdiagnosed the moment that it was trying to step in and provide answers for. And as a result of that, I think you're seeing them now have to reevaluate, couple 3 years later, reevaluate with this most recent conference what they're all about and step back and maybe pivot towards these more cultural issues. Now, I don't think they necessarily have good answers on the cultural issues. I think we have some pretty big disagreements on those as well. But I'm not at all surprised to see that pivot because that is what my understanding of the sort of survey research would have has been suggesting all along.
Well, we were talking about this earlier too. That one of the complications of I think we agreed on some similar diagnoses of the problems within our culture. And the solution that's being offered up from the national conservative side is to say we can make, law and policy changes that will address these problems. And I agree with you from our conversation earlier that they're cultural problems, and the problem with trying to solve them with political solutions, which there's a political system for a reason, is to try to mete out some of the decision making that needs to happen in a country like this. But you will have one, just because you ban something doesn't mean that it goes away. We should learn that lesson from prohibition, from the war on drugs. Just because you pass a law doesn't mean that the law is going to do what it says on paper. And it will produce unintended consequences, some of which are foreseeable, some of which are not foreseeable. But I think that one of the challenges for making the argument that these are cultural problems and we need to fix them culturally is it's hard to describe what that looks like. I'm curious any thoughts you have on how do you approach making that argument to say the political solutions not only won't work, but there could very well also make things worse. And I think the argument you get back in is that you're in favor of doing nothing, but it's often hard to describe. I'm not in favor of doing nothing. It's hard to describe what the something is that you'd be in favor of doing.
Yeah, it helps, I think, to remember that life is not politics. Life is much bigger than politics. So when there is a problem, one thing you could do is you could pass a law and hope that the law will fix it. I think for almost all of our problems these days, they're ultimately cultural, and passing a law is akin to thinking that you can wave a magic wand. It's magical thinking. You're not going to pass a law and fix some of the problems that are the sort of deep dysfunctions in our culture. But fortunately, life is bigger than politics. Life is bigger than government. There are many ways to go about trying to solve problems or address problems, make things better, that go way beyond sort of calling in the coercive power of the state. So individuals, families, communities, civil society, institutions, there's a long tradition in Christianity of assuming that these are the institutions that should be on the front lines of trying to solve problems. And so I think we have sort of forgotten that. Part of this is because of the legacy, I think, of the New Deal and of the sort of the progressive idea that when there's a problem, the federal government will solve it.
The state can be there to love you too.
Yeah. I mean, it has trained us to be more apathetic than we would otherwise be. To assume that the problem is being solved by someone else, I'm paying my taxes, that's all that's expected of me. Well, no, that's never the way it was supposed to be at all. Most of these problems cannot be solved by the federal government, and we are supposed to be on the front lines. And so in many ways, it's unfortunate that the state has crowded out these alternative, voluntary and private solutions, or entities that could try to come up with solutions. It's hard to compete against the state. That's what crowding out means. I think we need to be willing to do it anyway. And yeah, it's hard. There's not super straightforward answers on how do you, when there is a crisis, sort of spiritual crisis, a lack of sense of meaning and belonging in many places among many people in our sort of, highly alienated world. There's not a super straightforward answer for how you go about fixing that, because I don't think it can be done on scale. I think it is a sort of person-to-person, it's a person-to-person answer. That's the only way this works, and it has to be done by. There's no answer. There's no other. It's your options are wave a magic wand and hope that it will solve it, or buckle down and get ready to do the hard work of connecting with the people around you and looking for solutions that way. And those are your answers. I recognize that it doesn't seem very satisfying to a lot of people, but that I think really gets at the core of the problem with our culture, which is that we have forgotten the way we are supposed to be connected to each other and interact with each other.
Yeah, I'm thinking now of the piece that Yuval Levin had in the Dispatch. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But and we're going to have Yuval on the podcast coming up soon to talk about that piece. But what's interesting to me in there is that what we're seeing is that a lot of these problems come from we often think the problems that come in culture come from people behaving recklessly, right? And that what he pointed out in that piece, looking at a study from some colleagues of his at AEI, is that people are sitting on the sidelines, that they are not engaging, they're not diving into life much at all. So you get some of the good benefit stuff, that things that we would point to that we would like a falling divorce rate and fewer abortions happening. But what he points out for context there is that, fewer people are getting divorced because fewer people are getting married. Fewer people are getting pregnant, which is one of the reasons why there are fewer abortions. To say you can certainly be happy about those results, but you can also identify that there is another pathology there that is preventing people from being engaged in their own lives. And I think my thought when I was reading that piece is that I think you can connect this as well. It made me think about the pandemic and the way that we are just absolutely terrible at assessing risk. And so much of the dominating thought of it was to avoid risk at all cost. And you just can't do that in life. You can't avoid it at all costs. There are certain things that it makes sense to try to mitigate your risk there. But at some point, living life is a risky business, and you have to, as you said, kind of get in there, get your hands dirty, and actually live if you're going to try to fix some of these cultural problems that may be coming as much from our inaction as bad actions.
Right. And I like I said a moment ago, I recognize that it could be frustrating to say, like, well, what are you doing to solve this problem? When there are so many ways in which current policy and certain current ways that state power is exercised actually makes it much more difficult for private solutions to bubble up and for us to experiment and try out these different things. I mean, just like Catholic hospitals, for example, are facing an unending barrage of lawsuits from, for example, the ACLU, trying to essentially put them out of business or force them to, provide abortion services and things like that. This is a private, a sort of this is an exercise of charity on the part of the Catholic Church to provide healthcare services in communities that might not otherwise have access to them, to serve the poorest among us. Also, by the way, creating jobs because they're operating a hospital, which is a source of many jobs in many communities. And rather than celebrating and applauding, the church's willingness to get in there and get their hands dirty in this way that we're talking about, the ACLU and many activists on the left have said we will force you to bend to our will or not exist at all, and we'll use the power of the state to do that. This is a problem. I mean, it makes it much harder for people to be charitable and to sort of have the motivation to get in there and do what needs doing. And so I think in terms of talking about public policy, the number one thing that we should be talking about, I think, is not new ways to seize power of the state and wield it to get what we want coercively, but rather how can we figure out how to roll back these many ways in which bad policy is stymieing people from being able to, and making it much harder, making it much more uphill battle for people to be involved and to try out and experiment with each other and come together and experiment and just exercise their human creativity to try to help each other in the ways that they would otherwise be doing if the state weren't standing in their way.
I want to come back to your article for a final question here. So understanding the context in which Pope John Paul II was operating there at, really what we assume is the height of the Soviet Union, but actually the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, but nonetheless helped along by things that he chose to do. Looking at our present times, what's the biggest lesson that you think we can learn from him and from what we know about the role that he played in such a momentous and incredible event in world history? Yeah,
I think, again, the way that his strategy for combating communism is often remembered is it was cultural resistance. It was decidedly nonviolent. He was insistent, and the solidarity movement that rose up, sort of inspired by him, was just absolutely committed to nonviolent resistance at the level of the culture. And that's a thing that I think it should be an inspiring model for us, as it is absolutely true that we do face threats in the world, and as people of faith are in many ways, not wrong to feel that they're under assault from the left and sometimes from the state. We still have a choice about whether to respond at the level of persuasion and conversion and meeting people where they are and trying to change hearts and minds and behaving in a nonviolent way, or if we're going to reach for power for the sake of power in order to impose our way of life on other people and destroy those who disagree with us. Like, that is a choice that we will always get to make. And I think we need to keep the lesson, the story of JP2 in our mind as we are making that choice, going forward.
Stephanie, you're here in our offices because you were at our annual dinner last night for the retirement of and moving to President Emeritus of our co-founder, Father Robert Sirico. And what you were just saying there reminded me of something he said in his speech last night. They were always free to propose things to others, not to impose on others. I think that's a good message to leave it there. Stephanie Slade is managing editor at Reason. Her article that we've been discussing today in the most recent edition of Reason magazine, a special edition titled The Ashes of the Evil Empire. Her article is The Pope Who Helped Bring Down Communism. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us today on Act in Line.
Thank you so much.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.